blood, sand, and ambition. In the heart of the Mediterranean, an ancient war would decide the fate of two civilizations. How did Rome, a small city-state barely larger than modern-day Boston, dare to challenge the mighty giant Carthage and transform North Africa into its golden granary? Picture this. It's the 3rd century before Christ, and the Mediterranean is essentially split between two superpowers. On one side, you have Carthage, a maritime empire so wealthy that their merchants could buy entire kingdoms. Their ships dominated every trade route from Spain to Egypt, and their coffers overflowed with gold from African mines. On the other side, Rome, still a regional power, still learning how to fight beyond the Italian peninsula. But here's what I want you to think about. What drives an empire to cross seas and deserts to dominate distant lands? What kind of burning ambition makes leaders send thousands of men to die in foreign sands for the promise of grain and gold? And honestly, if you lived in that time, would you have had the courage to embark on such an epic journey, knowing you might never see home again? You see, this isn't just a story about ancient politics or military tactics. This is about human nature itself, about how far we'll go when we're hungry for power, security, or simply survival. Today, here on Imperium Chronicles, we're going to unravel the incredible story of Rome's conquest of Africa. We'll journey from the brutal Punic Wars, those legendary conflicts that nearly destroyed Rome, all the way to the establishment of African provinces that quite literally fed the empire for centuries. And here's something that will blow your mind. By the end of this story, you'll discover how African grain didn't just feed Roman citizens. It sustained gladiators in the Colosseum, supplied armies marching across Europe, and even kept emperors in power. Without African wheat, the Roman Empire as we know it simply couldn't have existed. We're talking about a transformation so complete that Roman poets would later call North Africa the mother of grain and the empire's treasure chest. But this treasure came at a price written in blood and measured in the ashes of one of history's greatest cities. Before we dive into this epic tale of conquest and consequence, don't miss a single detail of this incredible journey. Hit that like button right now if you're ready to explore how a rivalry between two cities changed the course of world history. Share this video with anyone who loves epic historical stories, and make sure to subscribe to Imperium Chronicles for more legendary tales from the ancient world. And here's the most important part. Ring that notification bell. Because trust me, you won't want to miss our upcoming documentaries where we'll explore other forgotten corners of the Roman Empire. From the frozen frontiers of Britain to the scorching deserts of Mesopotamia, we're bringing you the untold stories that shaped our world. Now, let's march with the legions into one of history's most dramatic conquests. To understand why Rome and Carthage went to war, you have to picture the Mediterranean in the 3rd century before Christ as the ultimate game of chess. Except the pieces were entire nations, and losing meant extinction. Carthage was absolutely the queen of this Mediterranean chessboard. Founded by Phoenician settlers centuries earlier, she had grown into something that would make modern shipping companies jealous. Imagine controlling every major trade route from the Atlantic coast of Spain all the way to the markets of Egypt. Every merchant ship that wanted to cross the Mediterranean had to pay tribute to Carthage or risk having their cargo seized by Carthaginian warships. The Carthaginians weren't just wealthy, they were obscenely, ridiculously wealthy. Their capital city was a marvel that made Rome look like a collection of mud huts. They had harbors that could shelter over 200 warships, markets where you could buy silk from China and ivory from deepest Africa, and temples decorated with gold that would make pharaohs weep with envy. But here's what made Rome's leaders lose sleep at night. Carthage was expanding. And not just expanding. They were getting closer to Rome's backyard every single year. The first real clash between these two superpowers happened in Sicily, that beautiful triangular island sitting right between Italy and North Africa. And honestly, it started over something that seems almost petty now. A group of mercenaries in the city of Messana asked for help. It was 264 years before Christ when this whole mess began. The Romans looked at Sicily and saw opportunity. The Carthaginians looked at Sicily and saw their property. Both sides convinced themselves they were just helping local allies, but everyone knew what was really happening. This was the moment when two empires finally decided to test each other's strength. What followed was the First Punic War, and Punic was just the Roman way of saying Phoenician, which is what they called the Carthaginians. This war would drag on for 23 years, making it one of the longest conflicts in ancient history. Now here's where the story gets absolutely fascinating, and it shows you just how desperate and clever the Romans could be. When this war started, Rome had a problem that would be like trying to fight a naval battle with rowboats. They had virtually no navy worth mentioning. The Romans were land fighters. They knew how to march in formation, how to build siege engines, how to storm city walls. But fighting on water? That was Carthaginian territory. The Carthaginians had been building warships and training sailors for centuries, while Romans were still figuring out how to cross rivers without getting their armor wet. But then fate handed Rome an incredible gift. A Carthaginian warship ran aground on the Italian coast, probably during a storm or after a battle. Most people would have just salvaged the bronze and moved on. But the Romans? They did something that was either brilliant or completely insane. They took that wrecked Carthaginian ship apart, piece by piece. They measured every plank, studied every joint, examined every rope and sail. Then they used it as a blueprint to build not just one ship, but an entire fleet of Roman warships. In just 60 days, and this is according to the historian Pliny, the Romans went from having no navy to launching over 100 ships based on that single Carthaginian wreck. Think about that for a moment. It's like reverse engineering a fighter jet from a crashed prototype. The Romans literally learned naval warfare by copying their enemy's homework, and it worked so well that within a few years they were challenging Carthage's dominance of the seas. This wasn't just military innovation. This was Roman pragmatism at its finest. They weren't too proud to admit they were outmatched, and they weren't too stubborn to learn from their enemies. That wrecked ship became the foundation of Rome's transformation from a regional Italian power into a Mediterranean empire. But copying ships was just the beginning. Because while Rome was learning to fight on water, Carthage was producing something far more dangerous than any fleet: a military genius named Hannibal Barca. Picture this: a 9-year-old boy standing before an altar, swearing an oath of eternal hatred against Rome. That boy was Hannibal, and his father Hamilcar made him promise that he would never be a friend to the Roman people. It sounds like something out of a movie, but this actually happened. And that childhood oath would nearly bring the Roman Empire to its knees. Hannibal wasn't just any general. He was a tactical mastermind who could read a battlefield like a chess grandmaster reads the board 10 moves ahead. By the time he was 26, he was leading Carthaginian armies in Spain, and Rome was starting to realize they had a serious problem on their hands. Then came the move that shocked the ancient world. Hannibal decided to attack Rome not by sea, where they expected him, but by land. And not just any land route. He marched his entire army, complete with war elephants, across the Alps in winter. Let me repeat that. He took African elephants over snow-covered mountains to attack Italy from the north. The Romans thought this was impossible. The Alps in winter were considered a death trap, even for small groups of experienced mountain travelers. But Hannibal pulled it off, losing about half his army in the process, but arriving in northern Italy with enough force to terrorize Roman settlements for the next 16 years. While Hannibal was running wild in Italy, Rome was desperately looking for someone who could match the Carthaginian genius, and they found him in the most unlikely place. A young man barely out of his 20s named Publius Cornelius Scipio. Here's what makes Scipio's story so incredible. His father and uncle had both been killed fighting Carthaginians in Spain. By all rights, this should have been a story about revenge consuming a young man. But Scipio was different. Instead of letting hatred drive him, he studied Hannibal's tactics like a student studying a master. Scipio realized that to beat Hannibal, he couldn't just be brave, he had to be smarter. So he did something that was considered almost treasonous at the time. He took Roman military tactics and mixed them with strategies he'd learned from watching Carthaginian and Spanish fighters. He created a new kind of Roman army, one that was flexible enough to match Hannibal's innovations. The Roman Senate was skeptical. This kid wanted to take the war to Africa itself, to attack Carthage on their home ground. Most senators thought it was suicide. But Scipio had a vision: force Hannibal to come home to defend Carthage, and then beat him on African soil. 202 years before Christ, these two military geniuses finally met face to face at a place called Zama, about 5 days' march southwest of Carthage. The tension must have been incredible. Imagine the two greatest strategic minds of their generation, each knowing that this battle would determine the fate of the Mediterranean world. Hannibal brought everything he had: seasoned Carthaginian infantry, Spanish swordsmen, Numidian cavalry, and his famous war elephants. These weren't just any elephants, they were living tanks, each one capable of trampling through enemy lines like a freight train. The Romans had never faced anything like them in organized battle. But Scipio had spent years preparing for this exact moment. He knew about the elephants, and he had a plan that was either brilliant or completely insane. Instead of forming the traditional Roman battle line, he arranged his troops in columns with wide gaps between them. When the Carthaginian elephants charged, the Romans didn't try to stop them. They funneled them through the gaps like water through a sieve. Picture the chaos: massive elephants thundering forward, expecting to smash into a solid wall of Roman shields, but instead finding themselves running through empty spaces while Roman javelins and trumpets confused and panicked them. Many of the elephants turned around and trampled their own troops. Others ran straight through the Roman lines and out the back, doing no damage at all. With the elephant charge neutralized, it came down to infantry against infantry, tactical genius against tactical genius. The battle raged for hours under the scorching African sun. Both sides knew that this wasn't just about winning or losing. This was about survival. The loser's civilization would be at the mercy of the victor. And then came the decisive moment. Scipio had made a deal with the Numidian cavalry, the same horsemen who had been fighting for Carthage for decades. He convinced them to switch sides, promising them better terms under Roman rule than they'd ever gotten from Carthage. When those Numidian horsemen appeared on the horizon behind Hannibal's army, the Carthaginian general must have felt his heart sink. He was trapped between Roman infantry in front and cavalry behind. The tactical master had been outmaneuvered by his young student. Hannibal's army broke. The man who had terrorized Italy for 16 years, who had won impossible victories against impossible odds, finally met his match in a dusty field in North Africa. 20,000 Carthaginians died that day. Hannibal himself barely escaped with his life. As the dust settled at Zama, everyone present knew they had witnessed something historic. The battle didn't just end the Second Punic War. It ended Carthage's dream of Mediterranean dominance forever, and it gave Scipio a nickname he would carry for the rest of his life: Africanus, the conqueror of Africa. After Zama, you might think that was the end of the story. Rome had won, Hannibal was defeated, and Carthage was forced to pay crushing war reparations that would bankrupt them for generations. Case closed, right? Wrong. Because what happened next reveals something dark about human nature and the psychology of empires. For the next 50 years, Carthage did exactly what Rome demanded. They paid their tribute religiously. They dismantled their military. They even handed over hostages to guarantee their good behavior. They became essentially a neutered city-state focused entirely on trade and commerce. And that's exactly what terrified Rome. You see, Carthage was recovering. Even without an army, even under crushing debt, they were still Carthaginians, the greatest merchants and traders the ancient world had ever seen. Their economy was bouncing back, their population was growing, and their influence in North African trade was expanding again. In Rome, there was an old senator named Marcus Porcius Cato who ended every single speech he gave in the Senate with the same phrase: Carthage must be destroyed. It didn't matter if he was talking about tax policy, road construction, or grain imports. He always finished with those words: Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. The Third Punic War, which began in 149 years before Christ, was different from the first two. This wasn't about territory or trade routes or even revenge. This was about elimination. Rome had decided that as long as Carthage existed, Romans would never sleep peacefully. The excuse they used was almost laughably thin. Carthage had defended itself against attacks from a neighboring African kingdom called Numidia, the same Numidians who had switched sides at Zama. According to the peace treaty signed after the Second Punic War, Carthage wasn't allowed to wage war without Roman permission. Technically, they had broken the treaty. But here's what makes this so cynical. Rome had been encouraging those Numidian attacks for years. They wanted Carthage to defend itself so they could claim treaty violation. It was a setup from the beginning. When the Roman army landed in North Africa, the Carthaginians tried everything to avoid war. They surrendered their weapons. They handed over their children as hostages. They offered to pay any tribute Rome demanded. But the Roman general had secret orders that revealed Rome's true intentions. The entire population of Carthage had to abandon their city and move at least 10 miles inland, away from the sea that had made them wealthy. For a people whose entire identity was built on maritime trade, this was essentially a death sentence. The Carthaginians realized they had been betrayed, and they made a decision that would haunt Rome for generations. If they were going to die, they would die fighting. What followed was one of the most brutal sieges in ancient history. The Carthaginians, who hadn't fought a real war in 50 years, suddenly became desperate fighters defending not just their city, but their entire way of life. The siege lasted 3 years. 3 years of Romans surrounding the city, cutting off food supplies, building walls to starve out the defenders. Inside Carthage, people were eating leather, boiling shoes for soup, and according to some accounts, even resorting to cannibalism to survive. The Roman general in charge was Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of the great Scipio Africanus, who had defeated Hannibal. It must have felt like destiny, a Scipio finishing what his grandfather had started. When the Romans finally broke through the walls in 146 years before Christ, what they found was a city of ghosts. Most of the population had already died of starvation or disease. The final battle was fought house by house, street by street, with Carthaginian civilians fighting Roman soldiers in their own bedrooms. Here's where the story gets into legend territory, and I want to be honest with you about what we know and what we don't know. The famous story about Romans salting the earth of Carthage, spreading salt over the ruins so nothing would ever grow there again, this might actually be a myth. No contemporary Roman sources mention salt being used, and salt was incredibly expensive in the ancient world. It would have been like burning money, but whether they used salt or not, the psychological impact was the same. Rome wanted to send a message that some defeats are so complete, so final, that even the memory of resistance must be erased. What we do know for certain is heartbreaking enough. 50,000 Carthaginians, everyone who survived the siege, were sold into slavery. The city was burned for 17 days straight. Roman soldiers went through the ruins, systematically destroying every building, every temple, every monument that had made Carthage beautiful. The Roman historian Polybius was there, and he wrote that even Scipio Aemilianus wept as he watched the city burn. When asked why he was crying after such a great victory, Scipio supposedly said he was thinking about the fate of all cities, including Rome itself. But here's the incredible plot twist that most people don't know. Carthage didn't stay dead. About 100 years later, Julius Caesar decided that the location was too strategically valuable to remain empty. Carthage sat on one of the best natural harbors in the Mediterranean, and Caesar needed a base for Roman operations in Africa. So he did something that would have made Cato spin in his grave. He founded a new Roman colony on the exact spot where Carthage had stood. This new Carthage became one of the most prosperous cities in the Roman Empire. Roman settlers mixed with surviving African populations, Roman engineering built new harbors and aqueducts, and within a few generations, Roman Carthage was actually wealthier than the original Punic city had ever been. It's one of history's great ironies. Rome destroyed Carthage so completely that they had to rebuild it themselves. And here's something that'll blow your mind. The Romans eventually started calling North Africa the granary of the empire, their most important source of grain and wealth. If you're enjoying this incredible story of destruction and rebirth, hit that like button right now and let me know in the comments. Do you think Rome was too cruel to Carthage, or was this just the harsh reality of ancient politics? I read every comment, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on whether this level of destruction was justified or if it crossed a line that should never be crossed. Now here's where the story takes an absolutely fascinating turn. Because within just a few generations of destroying Carthage, Rome discovered something that would change the empire forever. North Africa wasn't just a conquered territory, it was a gold mine. Not literal gold, though there was plenty of that too, but something even more valuable in the ancient world: reliable food production. Picture this: the same lands where Hannibal had trained his armies, where Carthaginian merchants had built their trading empire, now became Rome's lifeline. The provinces of Africa, covering what we now know as Tunisia, Algeria, and parts of Libya, transformed into the breadbasket that kept the Roman Empire fed. And when I say fed, I mean really fed. These African provinces were producing 60% of Rome's wheat supply. 60%! Think about that for a moment. More than half of all the grain that kept Roman citizens from rioting, that fed the legions marching across Europe, that sustained the gladiators in the Colosseum. It all came from African soil. But wheat was just the beginning. The Romans discovered that North African olive trees produced some of the finest oil in the Mediterranean world. This wasn't just cooking oil we're talking about. Olive oil was the petroleum of the ancient world. You used it for cooking, for lighting lamps, for bathing, for religious ceremonies, even for medicating wounds. Roman African olive oil became so prized that wealthy families in Rome would specifically request oil from certain African estates, the same way people today might ask for wine from a particular vineyard. The quality was so high that African olive oil was literally worth more than its weight in silver in some Roman markets. Here's something incredible. Archaeologists have found Roman-era olive presses in North Africa that could process thousands of gallons of oil per day. These weren't small family operations. These were industrial-scale businesses that employed hundreds of workers and shipped their products across the entire Mediterranean. But here's where the story gets really wild, and it shows you just how creative ancient entrepreneurs could be. Some of the wealthiest people in the Roman Empire weren't senators or generals. They were African animal traders who supplied exotic beasts for the games in Rome. Cities like Leptis Magna, sitting on the coast of what's now Libya, became incredibly rich through what we might call the beast business. These weren't just random animal captures. This was a sophisticated international trade network that stretched deep into the African interior. Think about the logistics involved. Roman contractors would hire local African hunters to capture lions, leopards, elephants, rhinoceroses, ostriches, and even giraffes. These animals had to be transported across hundreds of miles of desert, then shipped across the Mediterranean without dying, then delivered to Rome in perfect condition for the arena. The profit margins were absolutely insane. A single live lion delivered to Rome could sell for the equivalent of what a skilled craftsman would earn in an entire year. A rhinoceros was worth even more. Some sources suggest that exotic animals for the games could cost more than a house in a good neighborhood of Rome. And this brings us to Leptis Magna, which became one of the most incredible success stories in the ancient world. This city, founded originally by Phoenician settlers just like Carthage, reinvented itself under Roman rule and became so wealthy that its public buildings rivaled anything in Rome itself. The citizens of Leptis Magna built theaters that could seat 15,000 people, public baths that covered entire city blocks, and a harbor complex so advanced that modern engineers still study its design. The city's main street was lined with marble columns imported from Greece, and the wealthy districts had houses with private baths, heated floors, and gardens that would make modern luxury hotels jealous. Here's what's really mind-blowing. By the 2nd century after Christ, Leptis Magna was actually contributing more tax revenue to the Roman treasury than many Italian cities. An African city that had been conquered by Rome was now helping to finance the empire that had conquered it. The animal trade was so lucrative that some Leptis Magna families became richer than Roman senators. They built private amphitheaters just to test their animals before shipping them to Rome. They employed their own ship captains, their own hunters, their own veterinarians to keep the beasts healthy during transport. But here's the beautiful irony of the whole situation. The Romans had destroyed Carthage because they feared African competition, but under Roman rule, African cities became more prosperous than they had ever been under Carthaginian control. The difference was integration versus domination. Instead of trying to suppress African prosperity, Rome found ways to channel it into the imperial system. African grain fed Roman citizens, African oil lit Roman lamps, African animals entertained Roman crowds, and African taxes helped fund Roman armies. Cities across North Africa began adopting Roman architecture, Roman law, Roman customs, but they kept their local languages, their traditional religions, and their commercial networks. It was cultural fusion on a massive scale, and it created a hybrid African-Roman civilization that was wealthier and more sophisticated than either culture had achieved alone. The farmers who had once sold their grain to Carthaginian merchants were now selling to Roman buyers at even better prices. The craftsmen who had made goods for Punic trading ships were now creating luxury items for Roman villas. The hunters who had once captured animals for local ceremonies were now building international businesses, supplying the greatest entertainment venues in the world. In the end, Rome's conquest of Africa created something neither side had expected, a partnership that made both cultures richer, more powerful, and more interconnected than they had ever been before. Now you might be wondering, how did Rome manage to control such a vast territory filled with so many different peoples, languages, and cultures? Because North Africa wasn't just empty land waiting to be farmed. It was home to Berber tribes who had been living there for thousands of years, Egyptian communities along the eastern borders, remnants of Phoenician settlements, and dozens of other groups who had their own ways of doing things. The secret to Roman success in Africa wasn't just military might, though they certainly had plenty of that. The real genius was in understanding that sometimes the best way to control people is to let them think they're still controlling themselves. Here's something that would shock most people today. The Romans were incredibly flexible when it came to religion. While they expected conquered peoples to respect Roman gods and participate in imperial ceremonies, they were surprisingly willing to adopt local deities into their own pantheon. In North Africa, this led to some fascinating religious fusion. Take Baal Saturn, for example. Baal was an ancient Carthaginian god associated with fertility and agriculture, exactly the kind of deity you'd want on your side if you're trying to turn Africa into Rome's breadbasket. Instead of banning Baal worship, the Romans simply merged him with their own god Saturn. This wasn't just tolerance. This was brilliant political strategy. By honoring African gods, Romans were telling local populations, "We're not here to destroy your culture. We're here to improve it." Suddenly, African farmers could pray to their traditional deity for good harvests, while also feeling like they were part of the Roman religious system. The same thing happened with dozens of other local gods and goddesses. Roman temples in Africa often featured hybrid deities that would have looked completely foreign to someone from Italy, but made perfect sense to African worshippers who were gradually becoming Roman citizens. But religious diplomacy was only part of the strategy. The other crucial element was infrastructure, and nothing says Roman infrastructure like roads. The Romans didn't just build roads in Africa. They built a network of highways that connected every major city, every important military base, and every productive agricultural region. These weren't just dirt paths either. Roman roads in Africa were engineering marvels. Stone-paved highways that could handle heavy wagon traffic, with drainage systems that kept them usable even during the brief but intense North African rainy seasons. Some of these roads were so well built that you can still drive on sections of them today, 2,000 years later. Here's why the roads were so strategically brilliant. They allowed Roman legions to move quickly to trouble spots, but they also allowed African merchants to transport their goods more efficiently than ever before. A Berber trader who might have taken weeks to get his products to market could now make the same journey in a few days on Roman roads. The roads created economic opportunities, but they also created dependence. Once African communities became used to the prosperity that came with easy access to Roman markets, they had a vested interest in keeping the Roman system running smoothly. But controlling the cities and the agricultural regions was only half the battle. The real challenge was dealing with the Berber tribes who lived in the more remote areas, the mountains of Morocco and Algeria, the edge regions where the Sahara Desert begins. These Berber communities were incredibly tough opponents. They knew the terrain better than any Roman, they could move quickly across landscapes that would kill foreign armies, and they had no interest in becoming part of anyone's empire. Some Berber tribes spent decades fighting guerrilla campaigns against Roman forces. The Roman solution was typically practical. Instead of trying to conquer every square mile of African territory, they focused on controlling the areas that mattered economically and strategically. They built a series of fortified frontier towns that served as both trading posts and military bases. Roman merchants would come to these frontier towns to trade with Berber communities. Roman manufactured goods, wine, and luxury items in exchange for local products, information about caravan routes, and sometimes military service. Many Berber warriors ended up joining Roman auxiliary units, bringing their desert fighting skills to Roman armies serving in other parts of the empire. And this brings us to one of the most incredible success stories in all of Roman history, something that perfectly demonstrates just how thoroughly Africa became integrated into the Roman world. In the year 193 after Christ, a man named Lucius Septimius Severus became emperor of Rome. This might not sound shocking until you realize where Septimius Severus was from, Leptis Magna, that same African city we talked about earlier that had grown rich from the beast trade. Think about the incredible journey this represents. Less than 300 years after Rome had destroyed Carthage and declared war on African independence, an African was ruling the Roman Empire from the palace in Rome itself. Septimius Severus wasn't just any emperor either. He turned out to be one of the most successful rulers in Roman history. He expanded the empire's borders, reformed the military, built some of Rome's most impressive monuments, and established a dynasty that ruled for almost 50 years. Here's what makes his story even more amazing. Severus never forgot his African roots. He spoke Latin with an African accent his entire life. He sent enormous amounts of imperial money back to Leptis Magna to fund public building projects. And he filled his administration with other Africans who had proven their competence in provincial governments. Under Severus, the Roman Empire reached its greatest territorial extent and arguably its peak of prosperity. And he did it while openly celebrating his African heritage and promoting other Africans to positions of power throughout the imperial system. By the time of Septimius Severus, the Roman conquest of Africa had achieved something remarkable: complete cultural and political integration without complete cultural destruction. African cities looked Roman, but felt African. African merchants operated in Roman markets but maintained their traditional trading relationships. African soldiers served in Roman legions, but brought their own military traditions and fighting techniques. The Roman Empire had become genuinely multicultural in a way that was almost unprecedented in the ancient world. And nowhere was this more successful than in Africa, where the combination of economic opportunity, religious tolerance, military cooperation, and administrative flexibility had created a hybrid civilization that was stronger than either Roman or African culture could have achieved alone. This wasn't conquest in the traditional sense. This was transformation. And by the end of the process, it was sometimes hard to tell who had conquered whom. So here we are at the end of our journey through Roman Africa. And I want you to think about the incredible paradox we've just witnessed. This story began with blood and hatred. Two civilizations locked in a death struggle that lasted over a century. It continued with one of the most brutal acts of destruction in ancient history, when Rome literally erased Carthage from the map. But then something unexpected happened, something that reveals a deeper truth about human nature and the complex legacy of empire. Roman Africa became a paradox. It was a land of conquest, yes, but it also became a land of shared prosperity. The same soil that had been salted with Carthaginian tears, whether literally or figuratively, grew the wheat that fed Roman dreams of expansion. The same harbors that had once launched Hannibal's war fleets now sent grain ships that kept Roman citizens from rioting in the streets. Think about this for a moment. Every gladiator who fought in the Colosseum, every legion that marched across Gaul, every senator who debated in the Roman Forum, they were all sustained by African grain. The empire that had once feared African competition couldn't survive without African cooperation. And here's what's really remarkable. The Africans didn't just survive Roman conquest, they thrived under it. Cities like Leptis Magna became more prosperous than they had ever been under Carthaginian rule. African merchants, African soldiers, African administrators rose to positions of power throughout the empire. An African emperor ruled Rome itself and expanded the empire to its greatest extent. But Roman Africa also teaches us something profound about the nature of empire and the resilience of culture. The Roman Empire eventually fell, as all empires do. The legions that had once seemed invincible were defeated. The roads that had connected the Mediterranean world crumbled. The great cities that had rivaled Rome itself were abandoned to the desert sands. Yet the cultures survived. The Berber peoples are still there, still speaking languages that echo across millennia. The agricultural techniques that Roman engineers perfected are still used by North African farmers today. The fusion of Roman and African traditions created new forms of art, architecture, and literature that influenced civilizations for centuries after Rome's fall. And this brings me to a question that I think is incredibly relevant to our world today. Are we still repeating these same cycles? Do we still see powerful nations trying to control distant lands for economic advantage? Do we still witness the complex dance between conquest and cooperation, between domination and mutual benefit? When you look at global trade networks today, when you see how modern nations compete for resources and influence, when you observe how cultures adapt and survive even under foreign pressure, doesn't it feel familiar? The Romans called Africa their granary. Today, we have our own versions of essential resources that nations will fight to control. But the story of Roman Africa also offers hope. It shows us that even relationships that begin in violence and mistrust can evolve into something more complex, more mutually beneficial. It demonstrates that cultures can adapt without losing their essential identity, that conquered peoples can become partners, that empires can transform from instruments of oppression into frameworks for cooperation. The ruins of Leptis Magna still stand in the Libyan desert, their marble columns testament to a time when African cities rivaled Rome itself. The Roman roads still cross the North African landscape, now covered by sand, but still visible from satellites. The olive groves that fed Roman lamps still produce oil that lights homes across the Mediterranean. These aren't just archaeological curiosities. They're reminders that human civilizations are incredibly resilient, incredibly adaptable, and incredibly interconnected. The same forces that brought Rome and Africa together, trade, migration, cultural exchange, the search for security and prosperity, are still shaping our world today. If this incredible journey through Roman Africa has captured your imagination, I want to hear from you right now. Hit that like button and let me know in the comments. Which empire do you want to explore next? Should we march with Alexander's armies into the heart of Asia? Should we sail with Viking raiders across the North Sea? Should we walk the Silk Road with Chinese merchants and Arab traders? The world is full of these amazing stories of conquest and cooperation, of destruction and creation, of empires that rose and fell but left legacies that still shape our world today. And I want to explore them all with you. So subscribe to Imperium Chronicles right now and join our community of history lovers who believe that the past isn't just something that happened, it's something that's still happening, still teaching us, still challenging us to understand our own world better. Follow us on social media for behind-the-scenes content, additional research, and discussions about the historical topics that fascinate you most. And remember to ring that notification bell so you never miss our next adventure into the incredible stories that made our world. Because history isn't just about dates and battles and dead emperors. It's about understanding how human beings have always struggled with the same challenges we face today. It's about learning from the successes and failures of the past to build a better future. The Romans and Africans who lived through the events we've explored today could never have imagined that their stories would still be told 2,000 years later. But here we are, still learning from their triumphs and their mistakes, still amazed by their achievements and their failures. Until our next historical adventure, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep remembering that every great story from the past has something to teach us about the present. This is Imperium Chronicles, and thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through Roman Africa.